Hello. In this section, we'll be looking at the Industrial Revolution and Britain. To begin with, we want to stress there was industry and machines that were powered by things other than human beings or animals before the Industrial Revolution. And the big source of power before the Industrial Revolution was water power. And you can see two examples here. This, of course, is a water wheel that is pushing this wheel here to make a grindstone roll to grind grain, right? To make grain into flour, right? To make cornmeal or to make flour out of wheat. If you don't have the machine to do that, you have to do it by hand, which is a process that could take a very, very long time, and of course was also incredibly hard work. To give you another example, this is a water wheel being powered by a river that's being used to raise and lower ore from a mine, right? This is a mine shaft, and they've got this hoist that they could use to put people down in the mine and bring them back up again, or to haul up what they've been mining. So these are labor-saving devices using water power. Now, water power is great. One of its big advantages is, of course, other than supplying power, is it does so very cheaply, right? It's not like you have to pay the river, right? The river just flows. So that's a huge advantage. Now, however, there are two disadvantages to water power. One is that it's limited. There's only a finite number of places where you can actually put your machinery, because there's only so many places where the water exists and where it runs fast enough for you to use. And that goes to the second disadvantage. The river that you want to use is not always in a convenient place. It may not be near to the resources you want to use. It may not be close enough to a population of workers. So water power is great, but in part because it's free, but it's very limited, right? It's very limited. And that's where steam engines come into play. Now, you'll recall that we talked about how science is great because it allows the production of new, more complex inventions quickly. And it doesn't get much more complex than a steam engine, right? It doesn't get much more complex with the steam engine. In order to make a steam engine work properly, you have to have a deep understanding not only of physics, especially the physics of gas, right? Because a steam engine basically works using compressed air created by a fire burning some kind of fuel. You also need to understand metallurgy. You need to understand a lot of different things and math in order to make something this complex, right? Something this complex work. And science allowed for this kind of envisioning of such devices. And shortly after the scientific experimentation, Europeans will increasingly experiment with steam engines. Now, in the 1760s, James Watt, there's a unit of power named after him, right? You buy like a 60-watt light bulb, it's named after him. He developed a efficient steam engine, right? He didn't invent the steam engine. There were steam engines before James Watt, but he developed a very efficient one that allowed him to pump water out of coal mines, right? Basically, here's the problem is when you mine, you can only go so far down before you hit groundwater, and then you have to start pumping the water out, or you have to find miners with gills, because human beings cannot breathe underwater. And the problem is eventually the water rushes in so quickly, once you go deeply enough, you're not able to just pump it out with hand pumps. So what's going to happen is James Watt develops a steam engine that is very efficient, that can be used to pump water out of coal mines so that miners could do work. What does that mean? Well, now the amount of coal increases, the supply of coal increases, meaning that it will become cheaper. Right. So one thing that's important for us to understand is inventions tend to build on one another. James Watt develops a more efficient steam engine. That means that the supply of coal goes up because now we get access to coal that we didn't have because we have his steam engine to pump the water out. That drives down the price of coal because now the supply is up. That means coal has become cheaper. We can actually start using it to power machines instead of water. Right? The price of coal will drop, and then coal becomes so cheap that it can be profitable to burn coal to power machines instead of relying on water power. That means factories can go anywhere and are becoming cheaper to run and therefore more profitable. Right? You put a factory wherever you want, put it near the ocean, put it near resources you want to use, put it near a population center so you have workers, and you could now make it run at very low prices. So factories can now be placed anywhere. Raw materials can be delivered to them cheaply, made into manufactured goods efficiently, and then exported to a world market. Now you may say, wait a second, right? I understand this bit about the factories, but how is it they're able to have raw materials delivered to them cheaply? How can they be made into, and then how can they be exported to a world market? How's that going to work? Well, you could use steam engines to do things other than power machines that make things. You could, of course, put a steam engine with wheels and a cart, and then you get a railroad. And that can be used to cheaply bring raw materials to a factory so that they can produce something. It can then take that manufactured good to a port, or I'm sorry, to anywhere in the country that has a railroad, or it can be taken to a port and then loaded on a steamship. They can then take it all over the world. So you're going to have this revolution in both manufacturing and transportation made possible by the development of efficient steam engines, which of course is made possible by the scientific revolution, right? The scientific revolution is necessary for an industrial revolution. And I want to point out, I include this picture on purpose. You'll notice this is kind of an odd picture. This isn't quite how an American flag looks. And it's not, this is kind of weird how this is spelled. I don't know if this is supposed to be fairy dart or fire dart or what it is. It looks like it's fire dart, but they didn't get the spelling right here, and here it's not consistent. And they left the A out. So this is kind of a bizarre drawing. Well, it was drawn actually by someone from Japan. And they were trying to describe an American steamship. And the Japanese, just about, I think, less than a decade after their first exposure to steamships, they're able to start building their own steamships. So the idea is that this industrial revolution is going to spread very, very rapidly. And while there might be some misunderstandings at first, very quickly people are going to understand them more deeply. Now, going along with this revolution in manufacturing and transportation, there's also a revolution in communication. Right? There's a revolution in communication. You're going to have the development of the telegraph. Now, basically, a telegraph is a wire which electrical impulses are sent down. And these impulses are like beeps. And there's two. There's short beeps like dit-dit-dit, and there's longer ones like duh-duh-duh. And you can use these to launch a code, something called Morse code. So, for example, you probably have heard of SOS, right? Save our souls, save our ships. It's meant just to say, hey, we need help right away. That sounds like this. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long. And you, just like I knocked it out there on my desk, you can also use these electrical impulses to send it on a telegraph line. And these were not difficult to put up. These are federal soldiers during the Civil War. They are putting up these telegraph lines. You can see it's literally just a pole with a line on it. These often followed railroads. But this allowed for communication between armies and between the President of the United States and the Army in the field, right? So here is this is a telegraph machine. This is connected to one of those wires, and this is sending those impulses, those dots and dashes, which are then written down, and then they're transferred into English through Morse code, right? They're being sent Morse code. You translate that into English. And what this meant was, instead of having someone physically have to carry a letter, wait for a response, and then carry a letter back, which could take days or even weeks, now it only takes a matter of hours. So this revolution is huge, right? We're now able to make things in huge quantities. We can transport those things all over the world, and it's no longer physically necessary to, or it's not no longer necessary to deliver a message to have someone physically do it. You can do it electronically. So you have these massive transformations that are being undertaken in the Industrial Revolution. So we have some massive transformations going on, and they're centered in Britain. And a question that I think is reasonable to ask is, why Britain? Why is it that the Industrial Revolution happens there first? And what I would argue is, generally, this happened organically. No British person sat down and said, let's have an Industrial Revolution. Right? They were smart, they were advanced, but not that much. Right? No one can have that kind of vision. It was a long process that required multiple things to happen. One of the first was there was consumer demand from increased wealth brought by trade. So remember, Britain was building an overseas trading empire, and that was making British people wealthy. And as British people got more wealthy, naturally they wanted to buy more stuff. So you had these rich people and even middle people who were going around saying, I got money, I got to do something with it. And of course, other people said, well, great, I can make money making stuff for these people so they have something to buy. So increased wealth through trade encourages production, right? As people become wealthier through trade, they have money, they'd like to buy something with that money. Whenever someone has money they want to spend, someone will figure out something for them to spend it on. And that's going to encourage production. The scientific revolution and scientific advances will then help lead to steam power. Right? So you've got more and more people who want more and more stuff, and now we have machines that can make them more stuff. Third, in Britain, there was lots of cheap coal and iron. Right? There was a lot of cheap coal and iron. You need cheap coal to power the machines, the railroads, and the steamships, and you need cheap iron to build them. If there wasn't a lot of cheap iron and coal, this would have been a very difficult thing to undertake. In addition, Britain, because of its experience with trading, had very advanced banks that could lend money. Banks allowed people to raise money to build these factories, to start railroads, to do all these things. Right? These machines, these railroads, these steamships, they're all expensive. But banks allowed people to mobilize capital, to mobilize money so they could buy these machines. In addition, Britain gave protection to property rights. So you knew that if you built a factory, the government wouldn't say, that's a nice factory, I think I'll take it. Right? This is a threat. Remember we talked about earlier that oftentimes the economy followed political interests. Whenever people got richer, the political elites would take away their wealth. Well, in Britain, that was really hard to do because there were legal protection for property rights. So you couldn't just say, hey, that's a successful business, I guess it's the government's now. In addition, this included intellectual property. So if you made an invention, you could get it patented, and then people would have to pay you to use your invention. So James Watt was inspired in part to develop an efficient steam engine because he knew that if he developed it, he could get a patent and people would have to pay him to use the technology he developed. If he spent a lot of time and energy developing technology and then people could just steal it, you would be crazy to waste money developing technology. You would just steal it from other people, and then you wouldn't get any innovation. So it's very important to protect property rights, especially intellectual property rights. If someone could just steal your ideas and not pay them, why would you invest in coming up with new ideas? In addition, we'll talk more about this later, but Britain encouraged free trade with independent Latin America. British people, basically the idea here is that if you start having people work in factories, they're not working on farms. And you'll run out of food, right? If everyone's working in a factory, no one's producing food, you're not going to have any food, people will starve to death. But what happened was Britain supported free trade. They were able to engage with free trade with an independent Latin America, which grew lots of wheat, corn, beef, and other things. And they could then use the proceeds they got from that trade, their manufactured goods they produced, to buy food to feed their workers who are no longer farming. Right? So Britain is able to produce a lot of stuff. It's really good at manufacturing, and then sells that stuff on the world market to be able to buy food so its workers can still eat even though they're not farming anymore. Now, here's the thing I have to stress. If any of these things are missing, this doesn't happen. That's what I mean. You can't just plan an industrial revolution. If there weren't cheap coal and iron, if you didn't have banks, if you didn't have the machines, none of this would happen. If you couldn't feed the workers. It was all these different factors together, working together organically, that led to the natural outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution. It's not something that anyone designed. It kind of evolved on its own. But to kind of summarize this list, British people knew how to build machines. They had the resources to build those machines and transport what they made. They have the people to operate those machines, and they have access to the food they need to feed those workers who are operating the machines. And just to give you an example, some statistics and images to help us understand the development of the Industrial Revolution. Here's a chart of British iron production. In 1740, Britain was producing 17,000 tons of iron. 100 years later, they're making 2 million. In 1852, they were making 3 million. That was more than the world combined. That's what the Industrial Revolution allows. Imagine the kind of power that gives you. Literally, you can now build battleships and cannon, which you wouldn't been in such numbers that you wouldn't have been able to build before. And this led to an overall growth rate in the economy, right? So the Industrial Revolution, it has kind of its origins here. They're coming up with the new machines. It starts to take off here. It's really exploding here. And look at how average British income per capita is going up, right? It's going up only 0.25% in this period. That's not bad because it was almost stagnant before that. But it's doubled by this time. Still not great, but it's gone up by 8 times here compared to here, right? 4 times compared to this. So the Industrial Revolution is allowing astounding growth rates. And to give you kind of a visual representation of it, you can see in just 10 years how railroads exploded in England, right? In Great Britain, so we include Ireland and Scotland, right? They're developing this rail network. And if we look at this image, right, between 1843, 1845, 1876, and 1914, you can see how England is being honeycombed by all these different railroads. And by 1914, you can pretty much get anywhere you want on a train. So this is really transforming things. And one thing we have to emphasize, the scientific revolution was important, but knowing the fact that the Earth is not the center of the solar system, that the sun is the center of the solar system, the Earth goes around the sun, that doesn't make that much of a difference to your daily life. But being able to hop on a train and travel cheaply and safely all over the country, when in the past maybe you traveled, 20 miles at once in your whole life, that's a big change. So this is having a huge impact on people's lives, and that's a theme we'll talk about in a later section. Now, of course, once things get started in Britain, other people are able to have industrial revolution, right? So it gets started in Britain, and then people start looking at that and say, wow, what the British are doing is really cool. It's really making them powerful. We'd like to do that too. So what's going to happen is this. Britain will become a champion of free markets because it benefits the Industrial Revolution, right? It sounds really fair. Hey, let's just have free markets. Just everyone does their best, and then we trade. That's easy to say when you're the best, right? When your industries are the best. Of course you want to be able to have this kind of system because it allows you to buy, sell what you have cheaply and buy and a lot of it so you make money, and then buy what you want very cheaply. So free markets are kind of odd. They benefit whoever is the strongest. But this represents the triumph of Adam Smith, right? This represents the triumph of Adam Smith. So Britain's going to become the champion of free markets, makes it very powerful. Adam Smith's ideas are triumphant. And other countries say, you know what? We would like this power too. We would like to be able to compete with Britain, right? It's got all the advantages. It has all the power. We need to catch up. Now, in Europe, especially Western Europe and much of North America, capitalism and the Industrial Revolution will spread. So we now need to talk about the uneven spread of the Industrial Revolution and its relationship to inequality. So with the Industrial Revolution, Britain, which had already been a champion of free markets, is going to become increasingly so, right? This is the triumph of Adam Smith. Britain wants to be able to sell its goods freely with low tariffs on its goods, and it wants to be able to import cheap food to feed its workers. So Britain is really going to champion free markets and a kind of global economy. Now, what's tricky is Britain is not consistent with this, right? So, for example, Britain does not want free markets in India because it's its colony. It wants free markets everywhere else. I mean, this isn't to pick on Britain. This is just how human beings tend to be. But for the most part, Britain has the advantage. It benefits from free markets because it wants to be able to sell its goods all over the world and import food and raw materials from all over the world. And this represents the triumph of Adam Smith. And as the British mode of manufacturing, of trading spreads throughout the world, of course, it's going to impact other places. So in Europe and North America, capitalism and the Industrial Revolution will spread, right? They're in contact with Britain. British ways of doing things, like British banking system, for example, British products will start to circulate, and you'll also have an Industrial Revolution start developing in those places. In the United States, the development of our Industrial Revolution will actually look very similar to what happened in Britain. Right? It's going to look very similar to what happened in Britain. and by that I mean it develops kind of organically. But in France, Russia, and Japan, they're all missing some of those things we just talked about. Remember, I just gave you those 6 causes that are all necessary for the Industrial Revolution. So, for example, in Japan, the banking sector wasn't all that developed, and Japan didn't have a lot of iron, had some, but not a huge amount. And Japanese merchants were very hesitant to invest in factories. So in Japan, the government stepped in. The Japanese government said, in order to build a powerful country and maintain our independence, we need an industrial revolution. We've got a lot of this stuff, but we don't have all of it. So, we don't have the banks necessary to build up these things. So let's establish our own banks. The government will establish its own banks. Curiously, Japan will also, it uses its post office as a bank, which I think is interesting. So in Japan, you can open a banking account at your post office. And they said, the government will actually finance the first factories. And so the government gets them going, gets them started, shows it can be done, and then sells them off to private businesses. And then they're able to successfully undertake their own industrial revolution. So in countries that are missing one of those things, right, like I said, Japan did not have an advanced banking system, the government could step in to help out. And governments realize the Industrial Revolution gives you power. You don't want to get colonized. You don't want to be beaten. You need the Industrial Revolution. In other parts of Asia or Africa, they tend to lack those, at least one or more of those things, and they lacked a strong government willing to pursue industrialization. Right? So in some places, it's not going to happen. It's really amazing that it happened at all. Like I said, there was a lot of things that had to go together for it to happen. It did happen in Great Britain. Once Great Britain had it, other places could imitate it. But if you didn't have a strong government, we're missing too many of those things, you could not have it. You wouldn't have an industrial revolution, and that means you're going to fall behind. That's what's going to happen to a large part of Asia and Africa. Unfortunately, even though they often were wealthy and powerful, had advanced civilizations, because they're not able to undertake an industrial revolution, they're going to fall behind and get weaker. Now, like I said, this will be hindered in the colonies. Britain does not want India, for example, to build its own factories. Britain wants its colony, India, to buy stuff from Britain. So they don't always encourage free trade because they don't want competition. But all that being said, the Industrial Revolution is going to spread outward from Britain and utterly transform the world economy.